Greetings. We're at it again, my friends. Now, my name is Senator James Sanders Jr., and boy, what a business I have. In my business, politics, it's hard to get a straight answer to a straight question. You can ask one simple question and get 1,000 answers, none of which answer. But we're going to do something different here. On this show, we value clarity. And that's why the show is called, you guessed it, Let's Be Clear with Senator Sanders. We're going to be clear on this show. And we have taken one of the hardest issues around, the issue that everybody is speaking about, usually wrong. We're the loudest voices, know the least, and they are dominating the airway. The show is on big words, critical race theory. Man, I wish we had found some simple way of saying that, but there we go thinking again. Who says that everything must be simple? Now, I have two of the best minds that money can't buy on this issue, and we're going to speak on it. And we've reached way up to the to northern U.S., also known as Canada, and to a new state, Arizona, which is either coming into the union or going out, depending on who becomes the governor, I guess. So having said those things, my friends, and let me alert you that in such a saintly assemblage, the devil needs an advocate, and I shall be he. We're going to speak on critical race, and I'm going to channel my inner Trump. I'm going to channel all of the arguments that I have heard against critical race, and I am going to use them. Pray, dear audience, that I don't win this debate. Please pray that I don't win this debate, but I am going to try. Dr. Condon, who are you? Where are you? And why are you on this issue?
My name is Dr. Frankie Condon. I am an associate professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of Waterloo. I earned my PhD from the State University of New York at Albany. So I am a proud SUNY Albany graduate. And my particular areas of interest are political rhetoric, and especially rhetorics of race and class. So I'm really interested in how people are persuaded to think about race and class in particular ways, how they're persuaded to claim particular racial identifications and loyalties or not, and what the political efficacy is of conversations about race and about class.
Well, let my nativism act up here. You are an American, I believe.
I actually am an American. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania in a very small rural poor/working class community.
All right, just check it now. You got on my good side. I'm actually attending SUNY Albany even as we speak. Working on a master's, two classes away from a master's, but one step at a time. Dr. Shabazz, you're from the free state of Arizona, I believe?
Yes, I'm in Tempe, Arizona. My name is Professor Rashad Shabazz. I am an associate professor in the schools of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning and the School of Social Transformation here at Arizona State University. I'm a geographer, and I also am in the program of African and African American Studies. So my work is really at the intersection of race and geography. And what I try to understand is how race shapes our geographic lives and how geography shapes our racial lives. And what I've discovered over the years is that geography is one of the ways that race and racism make themselves present in our lives, be it housing segregation or school segregation, apartheid in South Africa, or the occupation of the Palestinian territories, that race and place align with each other and they construct the sort of language, the lingua franca, the landscape that we all live in and live our racial lives in. And it's within those landscapes that subjugation happens, that privilege operates. And so what I try to do is to really make those things visible and talk about how they shape our lived experiences.
Both of you are teaching classes that I absolutely would have taken. I might have got my C out of both of them, but that's all right. Both of our classes I absolutely would have taken. All right, the gloves are coming off. Dr. Condon, yeah, I'm hearing about this critical race theory. Now, how does it differ from Marxism? It sounds to me like it's a Marxist philosophy. Isn't this just some branch of Marxism?
Well, that's an argument that the Heritage Foundation makes, but I'm not sure that there's a requirement that people who work in critical race theory also align themselves with Marxism. Critical race theorists don't all think alike. We don't all subscribe to the same political philosophies. What we are concerned with is the enabling conditions that make different kinds of experiences for different kinds of people possible and likely. And we're interested in the racial dimensions of the lived experience of peoples of color and what makes those lived experiences unequal along racial lines.
Now wait, I should have stopped and asked you the first question first. What is critical race theory? I mean, come on now. If you're telling me it's not derived from what's his name, Marx in the 1848 or something of that nature, what is critical race theory?
Well, critical race theory is a framework for asking questions and studying the racial dimensions of our social, political, and economic and historical lives. So critical race theory, well, let me back up and say this. The attacks on critical race theory are really attacks on anti-racism. And there's a difference between anti-racism and critical race theory, although they're aligned. So critical race theory is what scholars do when we're studying the racial politics of lived experience or racial inequality or racial injustice or systemic or institutional racism. Critical race theory has a political valence in the sense that I think if there is a commonality among critical race theorists, we're all against racism. We all think it's a bad thing. And we are doing research that we hope will enable positive change that will create the possibility for greater racial justice. But attacking critical race theory is really about attacking anti-racism. And it's not a coincidence that the attacks on critical race theory follow immediately from increasing support by white working and middle class peoples of the Black Lives Matter movement. It's about political expedience, not about what critical race theory is.
Well, Dr. Shabazz, I see that you got one or two books in your background. Maybe you can answer this question too. What is critical race theory and how does it differ from Marxism, if it does?
So, as was stated, critical race theory is a lens, and it's a lens that we use to not only look at racial phenomena, but really to sort of look at the world around us. Critical race theory really sees race as being one of the central organizing principles of life in this country and in various other parts of the world, particularly in the Western world, but also in the former colonies. And given that, critical race theorists develop a kind of historical framework. We develop ways of understanding how race was operating in given moments, places, and times. We try to understand how race is woven into our institutions, how it's part of our cultural framework, how it manifests itself in political discourse, how it shows up in sport, how it's part of our political institution, how it informs our economic lives. In short, we try to really understand how race is a text by which people live their lives and understand the world around them. And given that, critical race theory is also trying to create solutions to the problem that Du Bois talked about in the early part of the 20th century, the problem of the color line, what it means to be Black in this world and what it means to live as a Black person in a world that is particularly anti-Black. But critical race theory is also a way of doing scholarship. It's a way of thinking. It is about bringing together different bodies of knowledge, history, philosophy, psychoanalysis, literary theory, and so many other kinds of ways of thinking. It's about bringing them together, harnessing them, and deploying them to paint pictures and develop understandings of the world around us. So in that way, critical race theory is no different than anthropology or the applied sciences or English, that it is a tool, a kind of conceptual lens to understand the world around us. Critical race theory is different in that it centers race. And the physical scientists did that in the 19th century when they were in the business of trying to demonstrate that people of color were biologically inferior and that white Western Europeans were superior. But really since then, race has been sort of this marginal element in much of academic life, and what critical race theory has been able to do is to really place it at the center and to begin asking questions about the world around us. And to the degree, as was said, one doesn't need to be a Marxist in order to understand or believe in critical race theory. But to whatever degree Marxism is informed, it is the sort of critical element. And that critical element is to not simply take the world as we see it as is. And critical scholarship, some of which is informed by the work of Marxist scholars, is attempting to sort of lift the veil on those things that we might see as normal or normative, be it about race or gender or class or sexuality.
Why do you guys forever want to drag up the past? Why can't we let it go and go on to, didn't we march and end all this stuff? Why are you forever trying to bring up the past?
Well, I'll quote my favorite writer, James Baldwin, who said that, sort of paraphrasing it, the extent to which we cannot deal with our past will inform our future. And our past is one that is profoundly shaped by race. Whiteness as a kind of, contemporary racial production, really, it evolves over the course of the 20th century. And that past, which gave white Americans access to the housing market, access to universities, access to jobs, shaped the production of white life. It shaped where white people lived, it shaped where they went to school, it shaped the churches they attend, it shaped the extent to which they had access to wealth. And that gave whiteness a privilege. It gave it a sort of mantle on which to situate itself. And whiteness was able to sort of pit itself against those things that it did not see was like it, namely Blackness. And so that relationship between whiteness sort of developing this relationship to privilege and then sort of pitting itself against Blackness is the text, is the mortar, is the foundation that shapes contemporary relationships between Black and white people. It shapes the contemporary relationship between Black wealth and white wealth. It shapes contemporary relationships between Black incarceration rates and white incarceration rates, and so many other phenomena. So the past is never the past. The past is our present. And the question critical race theorists ask is, do we have both the political will and the courage to understand our past to create a different present and future?
Well, Dr. Condon, why don't you want Americans to feel good about themselves, especially white Americans? I've been noticing stuff. First, I saw this attack on Christopher Columbus. Next thing I'm told he didn't discover America. We've been knowing that he discovered America for 400 years. And next thing I know, you're telling me he didn't discover America. Now you're taking down statues of great Americans all over the place. Why don't you critical race theorists want Americans to be proud of themselves, especially white Americans?
Well, I'm being a little bit flip right now, but I'll nuance this in a minute. I actually don't think white Americans have a lot of trouble being proud of ourselves or feeling good about ourselves. We have had, 500 years in the Western world and almost as long in what is now the United States, and also I think in Canada, for feeling good about ourselves. But really the more serious answer is that for me, critical race theory is not concerned with who individual white people are or how individual white people feel. Critical race theory is concerned with what we do and the impacts of what we do, whether those choices are made individually, whether they're made institutionally, whether they're made systemically, whether they're made at the state or the federal level. These are the things that worry us, that we study, that we want to understand, and that we want to contribute to the transformation of. So it's not that I don't want individual white people to feel good about themselves. That's not my concern as a scholar. I am concerned about what we are taught to believe, and by believing to do, that creates a world that is unjust for Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color across North America, including in the United States.
So why is, Dr. Condon, why are the critical race theorists so intent on getting into the public schools and the junior high schools and the elementary schools and teaching these children from day one that everything they were taught, or everything that their parents taught them, is a lie? Why is that so important?
Well, first of all, I'm not so convinced that critical race theorists formed a cabal to try and get into primary and secondary schools. I actually just don't think that's true. But second of all, this, I think, boils down to an argument about what constitutes patriotism. And for me, as a critical race theorist, it is not unpatriotic to notice and to name the ways in which our country fails to live up to the principles it espouses, that it claims for itself. It is a great act of patriotism to help our nation imagine, to see what we are not doing well enough yet, and to imagine how we might do better. And that, I think, is the work of critical race theory. It's not disempowering to students, if indeed they are being introduced to it. It's empowering for students, and it's empowering for a nation that is striving to be what it claims to be, that's striving to do, to enact the principles to which it has committed itself.
Well, Dr. Shabazz, can't we do this? I agree with the going to America is a project that we have not finished yet. Let's agree to that. Can't we do it without this critical race? Why can't we just say, here's what America should be, and do these things without denigrating past leaders, great leaders of this great country?
Well, I think that part of what critical race theory tries to do is it tries to show that there has been a gap between what the country says it stands for and what the country does, and how that gap is organized along race lines. But critical race theory is also trying to get us to confront ourselves. And I think that is the part that is the most combustible element of critical race theory. part of what it has meant to be white in this country has been to not engage questions of race, particularly vis-a-vis negative outcomes, right? So race, for many white Americans, is a kind of, apparition. It's a recognition that race exists, but the extent to which race maps itself upon whiteness, the extent to which, white Americans engage in an understanding of themselves as, racialized people is just not part of how race works in that respect in this country. But whereas for people of color, race is an always, already, ever-present thing that is oftentimes brought up in various parts of our lives, be it dating, going to church, eating, walking down the street, going to school, you name it. And one of the things that critical race theory does is that it demands that both in our past and in our present, that we make race central, and we particularly force a conversation about what race has meant for various populations, but particularly for white Americans. So in that respect, it makes what has been invisible for many white Americans vis-a-vis themselves visible. And that's very difficult. That's something that's difficult for white Americans and really sort of, many white people throughout the Western world to grapple with. But the consequences of not doing it have allowed us to be where we're at this moment. And neither our societies nor really our planet could sustain more generations not grappling with the realities of race. And so critical race theory wants us to make race central. We want our populations to understand how race works, how it informs our understanding of ourselves and the world around us, and to create strategies to transform our societies so that they are not aligned along the axis of race, and that we can create better, more fully functioning and harmonious communities.
Well, wait a minute, Dr. Shabazz. We fought hard in the 60s to have a colorblind society, and we won this. And now you critical race theorists are coming and saying that you want a society where we're looking at race. You can't have it both ways. What do you guys really want?
Well, color blindness is not something that I really critical race theorists in general would even advocate for. Even members of the civil rights movement didn't want a colorblind society. That's something that really sort of grew out of neoliberal and neoconservative think tanks. But colorblindness is part of what got us in this position. Sort of believing that not paying attention to race, particularly in things like education, health, housing, and education, particularly not paying attention to race, would somehow solve the problem. It actually made the problem worse because it allowed for the continuing of inequalities along racial lines. So colorblindness was really a strategy to not have to grapple with the reality of race. And critical race theory and also, anti-racist activists are demanding that race be placed at the center of the conversation. And, one of the things doing that does is it allows for white Americans to participate in the conversation in ways that they have not before, whereas the conversation has always been about people of color and the extent to which racial inequality is mapped upon our lives and our communities and what that means in terms of the longevity and the quality of our lives, which is significant. But what critical race theory is doing is it's taking a much more holistic approach and looking at race and asking how race shapes our lives. And that means white people as well. And doing that changes the discussion away from, well, what does this mean for people of color, Black and Indigenous and Latinx and Asian American communities, right? And thinking about what does it mean for our societies? how do white people understand themselves as racial subjects? And what does that mean in terms of our ability to organize our electoral politics in equitable ways? What does whiteness mean vis-a-vis questions of housing? What does it mean vis-a-vis questions of the labor force, right? And these kinds of questions and the histories around race as a social, historical, cultural, political phenomena helps us to understand the moment in which we live. And it helps us to understand how someone like the former President Donald Trump can emerge against the backdrop of the nation's first Black president. Critical race theorists were not at all surprised about the backlash that was created, but that is because of what that president, what Obama's presidency signified to the nation and the extent to which that caused deep anxiety amongst white Americans, and how the Trump presidency was able to take advantage of that. And so that's just one illustration of why a sort of critical race theory lens is important.
Well, Dr. Condon, the good professor spoke of a backlash, and I think I'm going to use this for a second. Look at the backlash that came from this 1619 project that's out there. I mean, didn't that lead to the 1776 project? Isn't the critical race thinking dividing America?
Well, I'm going to answer that by going back to your question about colorblindness, because one of the ways that the metaphor of colorblindness for racial justice works is by empowering, in particular, white Americans to not see racism. And if you can't see or won't see racism, then you can build a narrative for you about who you are and who the nation is, that is about having already achieved racial justice over and against the lived realities of Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color who are on the daily subjected to racial injustice. So it's, I think, fallacious to suggest that it's critical race theory, for example, or anti-racism that is creating divisions. The divisions already exist. The debate that we're having, the argument is about whether we will acknowledge those divisions and address them in a way that is just, or whether we will continue to promote a story about ourselves as a nation that says that regardless of what the facts are, we don't do racism, regardless of the realities on the ground for Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color.
Now, let me see if I got this straight. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and all these good people got out here to make sure that we get rid of the color bar and get rid of all of these things, keeping people back. We did it. We did it. Now you're here trying to tell me that we didn't do it, it didn't work. So what did we do in the 60s?
Well, we worked on it. I don't think Dr. King ever believed that we had arrived. I don't think Malcolm X ever believed that we arrived, or Fannie Lou Hamer, or any of the greatest of the civil rights leaders of the 50s and 60s. We got a start, and almost immediately we saw the rollback of the achievements that we had made during the civil rights movement. So, for example, in 1981, when Ronald Reagan makes a speech in which he asserts that, we haven't got complete racial justice, but it's good enough for us to dismantle affirmative action, he begins a process of rolling back achievements that were very hard won. And by the way, going back to your point about taking down the statues of great Americans, the great Americans whose statues are being taken down and placed, for example, in museums or archives, are generals of the Confederacy, the group that sought to dismantle the United States, to divide it. I think critical race theorists seek not to silence that history or to celebrate those figures, but to tell the truth about them and what they stood for and who they represented and what ideological and political interests they advocated for.
But isn't that just part of the culture of the South, and that we're trying to dismantle the culture and the well-being of the South by doing these things?
I think it's a sad state of affairs if the well-being of the South depends on us celebrating people who attempted to dismantle the United States to preserve the institution of slavery and the oppression and exploitation of Black Americans. I don't think it's true. I think that there may be Southerners who believe that celebrating that particular history without acknowledging the devastating consequences of those acts as they unfolded in time, but they're wrong, and we shouldn't celebrate that.
And if I could just add to that,
Please,
um, this is part of what the 1619 Project has been attempting to do. The 1619 Project is really trying to help us to understand the extent to which race was folded into, or race was the dominant narrative in the Civil War, and the extent to which that shaped why the Confederacy wanted to separate, why the Confederacy was deeply invested in maintaining slavery, and also why it was in the aftermath of the Civil War in the 1890s that all of these sort of daughters of Confederacy organizations began to memorialize and to create a kind of mythology about the gallant South, and why the Civil War was fought, which for them was about states' rights. But the war was fought to maintain slavery. The war was fought to maintain white supremacy in the South, right? And that is what the civil rights movement, in part, was attempting to demonstrate. That is what critical race theory as a body of scholarship is trying to illuminate. And that is what the 1619 Project is trying to share with the broader public. And so it helps us to really see the taking down of these statues, like the one just the other day in Virginia, I believe.
Virginia.
It's trying to really help us to say that these are not monuments to great men. These are monuments to a political ideology. These are monuments to white supremacy. And what does it mean? What does it say to our future generations to walk past an enormous stone-covered statue that is memorializing white supremacy and Black inferiority, right? And that is why critical race theory really attempts to put things at the center, because what we ask is, what are the consequences of those kinds of monuments? What must be done about them? And what are the stories that they tell? So in that respect, as was said, critical race theory is really trying to get us to grapple with and wrestle with the truth.
But Dr. Shabazz, why does a critical race theorist must be so boisterous? Why can't we do it some other way? Why can't it be done over time? Why do you have to change everything overnight? Why can't it wait?
Yes. Well, to quote Dr. King, who you quoted before, why must we wait? The story for racial justice is as long as the story of the nation. And lives, civilizations, entire families, and entire generations have been lost because of the reality of this racism. And so the urgency that has been hundreds of years in the making, the urgency that is really sort of paved with, the blood and the bodies of generations, is unfortunately a very long historical arc. And critical race theory, I think I can say this, is trying to do what it can within the sort of scholarly realm to expedite and to speed up how we talk about, understand, and center race in our conversations, our political, economic, and social lives in this country, and to provide us with a kind of language, a way of understanding, a sort of toolkit, if you will, to engage with ourselves as racial subjects, to engage with our life, the sort of social life around us, with a sort of lens or an understanding, and to most importantly, tell the truth about who we are. Only then can we create solutions. But the mythology of a colorblind society, the mythology of white supremacy and Black inferiority, the mythology of why the Civil War was fought, the mythology of the distinction between crack and powder cocaine, the mythology of racial segregation, the extent to which we continue those myths is the extent to which we chew up more and more bodies of people of color. It is the extent to which we continue the awful racial nightmare that racism is. Confronting them means that we have an opportunity, a chance to change the narrative.
That's a very powerful statement, Dr. Condon. In that statement, I heard that this is a political attempt to change the narrative, and this is not academics. This is pure politics driving and hiding underneath academia.
Well, let's understand the difference between, for example, opinion and theory. If what Dr. Shabazz was talking about was mere opinion, I would agree with you. But what Dr. Shabazz is talking about is a theoretical framework that helps us understand patterns across arrays of facts. He's not just making stuff up out of thin air, and that is not the project of critical race theory. Furthermore, you'd be hard pressed to identify scholarship across disciplines that doesn't have political implications. The difference between critical race theory and some other theoretical frameworks is that our commitment to social justice is explicit and built into what we do and how we do it. In other words, to the kinds of research questions that we ask, but also the methods that we use to pursue those questions.
So it's okay to be political as a critical race theorist.
It is as okay for critical race theorists to be political as it is for scholars of the delights of Western civilization,
which you guys seem to want to get rid of. Next thing you know, you're gonna say that the classics need to be gotten rid of, and we're getting rid of too many things in America. What, Dr. Shabazz, what's holding America together? If we're gonna hollow out the foundation of America, what's gonna hold us together as a nation?
It's a good question, and I really think it illuminates something, and I think an assumption that we have about the nation. So I think for many of us, what has held us together have been the mythologies. The gallant South, indigenous people handing over their land politely, as opposed to it being ripped from them, and their and them being discarded in the process. These mythologies have been one of the things that have held the nation together. The other thing that has actually held the nation together has been the tension around those who are on both sides of the color line. And that tension, that contradiction has really bound people of color and white people alike together. They've been bound together through this tension around racism, but it has bound them together. And so that sort of connection is as long as the nation. It is longer than these myths of the gallant South and why the Civil War was fought. It is longer than the myth that we figured all of this out in the 60s. It's longer than the myth around colonization. What critical race theory wants to do is it wants to use that myth, use that tension that has bound people of color and white people together and force us to look at the contradictions. That's it. Look at the contradictions. Let's understand how these contradictions have linked us together. Let's see how it has shaped our understanding of who we are. Let's look at how whiteness was created through whiteness saying what it was not, and how Blackness and indigeneity emerged as a result of that, right? Let's pay attention to that. And then let's ask a question. And it's really a fundamental question that I think runs throughout critical race theory. Do we want to continue this? Do we want to continue to do this? If so, why? If not, why? There's a sort of scholarly part about it, if you will. Journals have to get filled. But it's an important question because it forces us to look at ourselves, to look at our societies, to look at how we have all collectively and individually participated in this story and how the tension around that story and its implications has bound us together. And in looking at it, in unpacking it, in considering the implications of it, critical race theorists believe that we can offer some solutions. And the first solution is to recognize that race matters. Cornel West wrote that book nearly 20 years ago, and it's still relevant. Race matters. It mattered in 1492. It mattered in 1619. It mattered in 1865 and in 1965 and in 2008 and in 2020. There's never been a time when it didn't. And if we can accept that proposition, that opens up space for us to have a conversation about and what does it mean and how does it impact our lives? And what must be done to make the implications of race not negative ones, but at the very least, ones that are not harmful, ones that do not undermine the development of communities, ones that don't gut generations. And so in that respect, yes, critical race theory has a politics, in the same way that biologists sort of have a politics around their scholarship, or in the same way that, literary scholars might, or political scientists or anthropologists. No body of scholarship exists outside of politics. But in this moment, against the backdrop of the president we just had, critical race theory has emerged as this kind of catch-all, as a way to talk about transformations that are happening in the nation, to talk about the way in which conversations are happening, and also to signal what for many is a deeply anxiety-producing moment, which is the rapid demographic change of this nation, really over the last, so many centuries. And critical race theory is a kind of whipping boy, if you will, that has allowed for particularly those on the right to give expression to their fears and anxieties about a changing nation, signaled in part by the previous president, Obama, and the sort of, and what that will mean, particularly for white Americans. And so in that respect, it's a very kind of convenient political tool to throw red meat at a political base, to signify a kind of, fear of change and the anxiety that comes for that, and to sort of, really make visible that there is this change happening, and maybe this body of knowledge is helping to enable that change.
Well, I'll say it. We don't have to not say these things here. There's a widespread idea that that there's going to be some white replacement taking place in America, and by 2050, the nation is going to be majority minority, and it's just interesting that this critical race theory comes up right at that time, and it sounds like it's a thing that can allow the white replacement to take place and justify it. Dr. Condon, doesn't that strike your mind that this is coming up at the same time that that there may be a replacement taking place?
No, it doesn't strike me that way at all. I mean, the thing I guess I would say is that
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The audacity, this holding to this position is very difficult. I think I'm doing it too well. I'm getting sicker by the moment. But please, doctor,
okay,
you would say.
you're doing it very well.
Oh,
It's a little scary, but listen, here's the thing.
very scary.
Social justice is not a zero-sum game. If Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color enjoy access and opportunity and equity and inclusion in the same ways that white people do, that doesn't mean that white people will get less of all of that. There's no replacement strategy. There's a quest for racial justice that white people should be invested in. And in fact, this notion that social justice, that equality and equity is a zero-sum game is one that is produced and serves very particular political and economic and social interests. So, for example, it's a matter of historical fact that in the late 19th century, in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, and the steel mills of Birmingham and Pittsburgh, capitalists organized workers as if they were in competition with one another along racial and ethnic and linguistic lines and lines of national origin in order to agitate against unionization. The effects of that practice linger. History accretes, it doesn't just disappear. And so when we say, you know, the great replacement is coming and white people are going to be replaced and now we're going to be on the bottom and so we should hold on to the top even harder, we're actually acting out something that we have been taught to believe for 250 years. That's not true. We can all enjoy racial justice. We can all enjoy social justice. We don't have to give up everything in order to share that benefit, in order to share the fruits of American liberty, democracy, equality. That's the best of our nation, and all of us can have it.
Now, Dr. Shabazz, that sounds good, but you see, you're in a good spot there. You're in Arizona. You know that there are millions of folk who would flood to America if we don't keep the wall going, and all of this sharing and all of this is impossible if you can't take care of the world here, and this critical race seems to be weakening our wall, sir.
Well, you know, what I would say is that, you know, critical race theory, part of what we attempt to do is to tell the truth, have an honest conversation, uncover what has been covered over, point out myths. And in doing that, we have to sort of confront our realities. And in many ways, you know, racism over the course of the last 150 years has helped to structure immigration into this country. from the Irish in the late 19th century, Jews in the late 19th century, Eastern and Southern Europeans in the early 20th century, Chinese in the 19th century, Mexican migrants and others from Central America. So racism has really helped to structure the ebb and flow of that migration into the country. And the fear and anxiety that I think many white Americans have with this sort of zero-sum mentality of racial justice means the evacuation of privileges for white Americans. One body of scholarship in the sort of grand theoretical tradition of critical race theory, Afro-pessimism asks a real interesting question. An Afro-pessimist asked, well, if, anti-racism, let's say anti-racism doesn't work, right? That we will never sort of have this beloved anti-racist society. Because rather than give up or expand, that doesn't even have to be given, rather than expand opportunity for everyone, white Americans would rather keep it for themselves and destroy the country along with it. Now, that's a really pessimistic position to take. But I think if we simply look at the last 5 years, especially the events of January the 6th, the riots on the Capitol steps, it really illuminates something I think really painful and powerful. And it really highlights again why critical race theory is important. What we saw was mostly white Americans who were willing to deploy violence and force to stop an election, even if it meant just breaking the law, which was done, but deploying violence toward police officers and attempting to murder senators. It really says something about what is going on with whiteness in general and some white Americans, that the fear, the anxieties of change mean that for them, that change is a sort of zero-sum game. And rather than allowing the change to happen, that they will destroy the entire ship. Now, that is one of the questions that critical race theorists ask, particularly those who sort of align themselves with the body of thought within it called Afro-pessimism. What is going on with whiteness that will allow such a thing, right? My colleague, Dr. Condon, was right that it does not, critical race theory doesn't mean that something is being taken away from white people. It simply means that opportunity is being expanded. But what January 6th said is that, or at least one way of reading it is that it's either white supremacy or nothing. It's either white people control the economic and political institutions or nothing. It's either political control facilitates its way in and through white communities and white politicians, or no one has it. And this is a very scary predicament. And it's one that really needs a critical race theoretical analysis, because what we have to start to really confront is that in addition to histories and generations of racial inequality and the various life that has been lost as a result of that, the uneven economic development along race lines, but we also now have to grapple with the reality that there are some who want to simply see the end of the nation, who would rather burn it all down rather than expand opportunity for everyone. And that highlights something deeply nefarious about a certain kind of white supremacy, not the simple sort of neo-Nazi tiki torch white supremacy, but them too, but a real sort of sadistic, deeply held ideology that if white people can't run it, then it simply shouldn't exist. And critical race theory is an opportunity for us to sort of understand what's going on there and grapple with this reality that, at least, given what happened in January 6th, illustrates that this is a problem that we must confront.
Now, Dr. Condon, and I'm going to let you answer, but the doctor is ignoring that many of the leaders against the critical race theory are Black people and other people of color. And they're Larry Elder quickly comes to mind, and so many others. The guy in D.C., Woodruff, or Robert Woodruff, or something of that nature. These are leaders in the Black community that see the danger and have spoken out for the unity of the United States.
Well, come on, it can't come as a surprise to any of us that all Black people don't think the same way, don't all agree about everything. I don't think that critical race theorists are scared of people disagreeing with us. We're not scared of honest debates. We're interested because we're scholars. We're curious. We want to know, and we want to do well by doing good. That's who we are. So I'm not put off by or scared about or distressed by the fact that people disagree with us. What I am frustrated about is those arguments against critical race theory that sink to the level of logical fallacy to make arguments that are unfair or to represent the work that we do in ways that are reductive and untrue. I do think that Dr. Shabazz is right, that this question for white Americans is paramount at this historical moment. Who will we be? What will we bring to our nation and to the world with regard to racial justice? Is it the case that we would rather burn it all down than live in a world where we are dedicated shoulder to shoulder with Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color in service of racial justice? That is a paramount question. It is a great moral question for our time. And one of the, I'll just say quickly to end with, is that Hannah Arendt, who I don't think is right about everything, but she did say some smart things, says in her book on violence that the conditions for violence are most ripe when people who are habituated to power and privilege begin to fear the loss of what they know, the loss of what they have had access to. That's the historical moment that we are in. People are afraid of loss, but that fear, particularly I think in white working and middle class white people in the US, is produced. It's politically expedient for people like the former president or the ultra right wing or what is apparently the new Republican Party to make the electorate, to make its citizens afraid. Because when they are afraid, they cede their power and their agency to those extremists. That can't be a world that we want to participate in making or sustaining. It just can't be.
Well, my friends, the hour has traveled very quickly, and I'm going to give you a moment to make a closing statement. Dr. Shabazz, you'll go first since you were last before. And I will give you a few seconds to compose your mind by me alerting the audience, my friends. A disclaimer, I should have gave it at a better one at the beginning. The thoughts you heard me say were not mine. I was channeling my inner Trump. These are the things that I have picked up in the journey, the arguments, as false as many of them are, that I have heard people say, and when I try to listen to the other side to see what is their great fear, of a theory by its very nature is something that we should try, is we're trying to prove or disprove it, and therefore you need some open scholarship on this issue. We should not be afraid of it or to disagree, but in order to disagree, you have to, if we use logic, if we use reason, you are supposed to come up with better ideas based on fact. You can't just come up and say, well, I have an alternative truth. I have an alternative fact. You can't, I mean, it's cute to do that, but outside of a elementary schoolyard, you can't do that. That's not scientific. I'll speak more in a moment, but I want to, first things first, thank both guests. I really appreciated that you spent some time with me. I apologize for the Trump and all of us seem to have gone and really, in another life, I would be an actor. I guess since I can't do that, I have to be a politician. So under maybe if I acted better, I could be president. Wait a minute. One did that already. Well, Ronald Reagan, president, or the actor who became president. Well, there we go thinking. Don't forget Donald Trump, the reality host who became president. Well, there we go thinking. Dr. Shabazz, thank you very much for spending this time. What message, Afro-pessimistic or not, would you want to share with the audience?
Critical race theory is not the boogeyman, and looking at race and recognizing its salience doesn't make it exist. Race is part of our lives. It's always been part of our lives, whether we acknowledge it or not. It's like COVID. We can pretend it doesn't exist. We can deny all forms of inoculation, but there's a consequence to be paid for doing it. And critical race theory is really asking us to have both the courage and the will to look at ourselves, to look at our history, to look at our present in an attempt to create a better kind of future. And that we are well within the control of this, that we can make a difference, but only if we want to. And critical race theory is providing us with tools in which to do that. And so I would say, particularly to the white listeners of this, to, have the courage to really look at critical race theory, have the courage to really think about what it means to be white in this country, to investigate it, and then begin to figure out where your place is in the narrative that we craft moving forward. And I think if we as a society can do that, particularly white Americans, we might have a shot at ending the racial nightmare. But if we choose not to do it, we will pay a consequence. We will pay a price. And it will be a price that I think will be too high for any of us to really want to pay. So I'll close with that.
Boy, I heard echoes of John Brown's last statement there. I'm hearing historical echoes. Dr. Condon, thank you again, and your words.
Thank you so much. I want to start by saying it's such an honor to be here with you, Senator, and such an honor to be in the conversation with Professor Shabazz. So thank you so much for inviting me. Um, I'm a great admirer of the work of Dr. Cornel West. And one of the things that Dr. West wrote was made a really important distinction between optimism and hope. And what Dr. West said is that optimism is the sort of mindless assertion that things will get better in spite of all evidence to the contrary. And hope, Dr. West said, is the determined, the dedicated, the fierce engagement with that evidence in order to create a future that looks different than the world in which we live. I cling to that understanding of hope. And so when I think about Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color who are listening to this podcast, what I want to say is that I hope you will cling to that understanding of hope as well. And I think we have to search for a way to help white Americans get with the program without making the whole story about white Americans. Mm. Dr. King said, and also Dr. Derek Bell, who is one of the luminaries of critical race theory, said, it is not the job of critical race theorists to make white people comfortable. In some ways, the opposite is true. In some ways, critical race theorists set out to agitate, to make white people uncomfortable, because it is from a position of discomfort that we can see through the eyes of a stranger the world in which we have lived and moved as if it was all commonsensical. Like race relations and racial inequality and racial injustice are the air that we breathe. We don't need to look at it. We don't need to think about it. We need to be uncomfortable. It's by sitting in discomfort that we become capable of learning. And when we're capable of learning, then we become increasingly capable of engaging with those facts. That is, to being and doing hope, not just mindlessly asserting optimism, even in the face of all of the evidence that racism is real. And I'll end with that.
And a great ending. I will study that by Cornel West. I had never heard that, and I think there's a lot of truth in it. So I will absolutely look to that. I remind the audience that that I am a patriot, that I believe in this country more than this country believes in itself often. And I am reminded of Martin Luther King, one of his statements on the country. He was questioned by some reporters, and they said to him, "You really sound like you're greatly disappointed at this country." And he said, "It is true. I am greatly disappointed with this country, but that's the only way to be when you have a great love of this country, and that's why I'm trying to change it, because I'm greatly disappointed at what it could be." There are so many issues that we could have tackled on this show. I mean, we barely scratched the surface of critical race. I was just reading the other day, a very interesting article came out, and the name of the person escapes me, who was saying that that even at 2050, white supremacy may be maintained because it may evolve, it may incorporate other groups into it. And the writer, who is biracial, pointed out biracial groups, and he spoke of Latinos, the white part of the Latino community could be incorporated to give white supremacy more life, to keep it going years longer. Very interesting. You, in the back of your mind, you you thought of these things, but never as clear as the way that the writer put it out. On that maybe, that may be a very worthy future show where we get our Latinx brothers and sisters to speak of this. And man, I tell you, if we survive that show, we did well.
Senator Sanders,
Yes,
if I could just quickly say, I have to run because I'm going to teach my critical race theory class. And we're reading Afro-Pessimism by Frank B. Wilderson III. Today is our last day on it. But I would like to just say what an honor it's been here to be with you and to have this conversation. It's really been fantastic. And I really gotta go do critical race theory in the classroom.
Go. My friends, that no better way to end the show. Thank you both for being here. Thank you to the audience for listening. The audience needs to be in one of these folks' classes. You can probably do it by the internet. Thank you both. Go with God. Let's keep this going.
It was wonderful hanging out with you. Bye, everybody.